Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're diving into a regulatory challenge that really sits right at the intersection of technology, democracy, and digital trust. We're focusing on these recent efforts to govern digital content, specifically the proposed amendments to the Information Technology Rules of 2021.
Right. And these amendments, they're scheduled for implementation in November 2025. They are laser-focused on curbing the exponential misuse of what's called synthetically generated information, SGI, which is, the broad term that covers deepfakes and all that other AI-created media.
And that brings us to the core disagreement we need to unpack. Do these new mandates, and they are very specific, things like mandatory labeling, metadata embedding, enhanced verification for platforms, do they actually strike an effective, a sustainable balance? A balance between ensuring online integrity and, on the other hand, navigating the huge technical, financial, and privacy challenges of regulating generative AI.
That really is the crux of it. I'll be arguing that the systemic limitations of our current AI detection, coupled with some pretty significant concerns around user anonymity and the need to protect innovation, they make these proposed rules exceptionally difficult to implement effectively. And I think that risks over-regulation that doesn't even stop the threat.
And I'll be taking the opposing view. My position is that these strengthened due diligence obligations are absolutely essential. They're necessary to ensure online safety and security, and, most importantly, to finally establish some real accountability for digital intermediaries, especially those big ones, the significant social media intermediaries, or SSMIs. Without this kind of regulatory stick, I think the digital landscape just becomes ungovernable. The threat posed by SMI is, it's profound, and we have to respond with regulation that's just as powerful. The rule defines SMI as information that's artificially or algorithmically created, generated, modified, in a way that appears reasonably authentic or true. And that appearance of authenticity, that's the whole problem. It's what necessitates these precise, robust rules to strengthen what's called intermediary due diligence. Just look at the specific technical requirements the amendments impose on intermediaries that offer creation or modification tools. They mandate that SGI must be clearly labeled or embedded with a permanent, unique metadata or identifier. This isn't optional, it's a technical enforcement mechanism. We've seen the details for visual content, where the label has to cover a non-trivial area, at least 10% of the total surface. And for audio, it has to cover the initial 10% of the duration. That ensures immediate identification. The real power here, though, lies in the enhanced obligations placed upon the SSMIs. They have to get an explicit user declaration stating whether the content being uploaded is SGI. But more critically, they have to deploy, and the phrasing is reasonable and proportionate technical measures, so automated tools, to verify those user declarations. If the SSMIs fail this stringent due diligence test, they risk losing the legal immunity they currently have for third-party content. And that loss of immunity, that is the powerful incentive needed to ensure compliance.
I agree that the goal of tackling misinformation and deepfakes is vital, but I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the current approach is feasible with the technology we have today. The regulatory structure, as you've laid it out, it relies on detection capabilities and standardized technical markers that are, they're fundamentally challenged by the very nature of generative AI itself. I come at it from a different angle, the reality of the technical roadblocks. Existing AI detectors right now suffer from incredibly high error rates, mainly because there's a lack of any global standardized benchmarks. This leads to two critical problems for SMMIs. First, you have high false positives, where legitimate human-created content gets flagged as AI and restricted. And then you have high false negatives, where the malicious deepfakes just slip right through.
Tools like Midjourney, DALL-E, Stable Diffusion, they're engineered to generate hyper-realistic content that blends in seamlessly. That creates this imperceptibility challenge that just defeats automated scrutiny. And on top of that, you have to consider scalability and finance. The sheer volume of AI-generated content being uploaded every single second across the globe, it exceeds the processing and storage capabilities of most current detection systems. Scaling this mandatory verification to cover the millions of daily uploads, that poses a massive, maybe even an insurmountable financial and operational challenge. And finally, The metadata tracking required by these rules raises inherent privacy concerns about constant digital monitoring. It forces a dangerous trade-off between safety on one hand and constraining crucial AI innovation on the other.
I appreciate the technical reality check you've provided. I do, especially regarding false positives and just the sheer scale of the content. But I believe we risk paralysis if we wait for some kind of technical perfection. I think you're focusing too much on the technical challenges, when these challenges are precisely what are meant to be overcome through regulatory pressure. My argument, it really shifts the focus. The rules create tiered accountability, and they focus heavily on digital provenance, not just reactive detection. Provenance, in this context, is about tracking the content's origin, not just what it looks like now. Embedding indelible markers, you could call it digital watermarking, into AI-generated content serves as a verifiable digital signature. It's a guaranteed digital receipt. This is a key pillar of a durable solution. The mandate to label prevents intermediaries from modifying, suppressing, or removing those identifiers. It makes the origin traceable back to the creation tool, which is where accountability has to begin. And this isn't some domestic anomaly. Similar mechanisms are being explored or even mandated globally. You see it in China's requirements for mandatory AI labeling rules. And that loss of legal immunity you mentioned, that is the critical enforcement mechanism. It shifts the entire risk calculus for these platforms.
That's a compelling argument for the ideal outcome, I'll grant you that. But have you considered the immediate practical impact of this imperceptibility challenge on digital provenance itself? Provenance relies entirely on that initial creation tool embedding that permanent marker correctly and, crucially, indestructibly. But the problem is that sophisticated Gen AI is often engineered by malicious actors specifically to bypass these established detection methods. So if a bad actor runs the labeled content through, say, high compression filters or applies slight image alterations or uses advanced techniques like adversarial attacks, that permanent unique metadata you're relying on is often the very first thing that gets scrubbed or scrambled or just rendered completely useless. Then the content becomes untraceable. It's exactly as if the marker was never there to begin with. So if AI models are constantly evolving to create content that detection systems just fail to identify, generating a high number of these false negatives, the entire premise of relying on permanent unique metadata becomes moot, doesn't it? And let's be realistic. Achieving truly global standards for AI content detection, that's highlighted in policy discussions as a distant goal, a way-forward recommendation. It's not a current reality. So any domestic framework trying to mandate detection based on non-standardized tech is facing severe implementation hurdles, because the tech that generates the content is inherently designed to defeat detection. That's its function.
I understand the technical arms race that exists between generators and detectors. I do. But the rules also address behavioral accountability. They require SSMIs to get user declarations on whether uploaded information is synthetically generated. This is a crucial step towards fostering intellectual honesty and, well, user responsibility. It shifts the burden of proof, at least initially, back to the person uploading the content. And this isn't just theory. Enhanced accountability is already being successfully mandated in other high-stakes areas. We've seen the Election Commission of India issue an advisory on the disclosure of SGI during elections. This requires clear labels like AI-generated, on-campaign material, covering at least 10% of the visible display area. This shows that the government can enforce these specific, high-stakes disclosures. It works by mandating accountability from the user and the platform.
I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the user declaration requirement works as a significant deterrent. I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because relying on a user to declare something assumes good faith, and that's often completely absent in the people creating deepfakes for malicious, unlawful purposes. I mean, look at the data. The NCRB Crime in India report for 2023 specifically cited fraud and sexual exploitation as the predominant motives behind the surge in cybercrime cases involving synthetic media. People engaged in organized fraud or creating non-consensual sexual content are precisely the demographic least likely to check a box saying their content is SGI. So if the user's intent is malicious and covert, how can any platform, even with the most sophisticated automated tool, verify a declaration that was made in bad faith from the start? And this brings us right back to the SSME's liability, requiring them to deploy automated tools to verify every single user declaration. Given the documented lack of benchmarks and higher error rates, it means SSMIs are effectively liable for two conflicting outcomes. First, they face liability for false positives, which means restricting legitimate content and infringing on free expression. And second, they face liability for failing to detect the most malicious, sophisticated deepfakes that were designed to slip through. So the proposed rules are essentially penalizing platforms for technical limitations that are, right now, unresolved globally. It's placing an unsustainable liability burden on them.
But the overriding concern, given the societal stakes here, must be online safety and accountability. We can't afford to wait for some theoretical technical perfection while the real-world harm escalates. Look, there was a 31.2% surge in registered cybercrime cases just over the last year. These rules are framed to enforce the lawful processing of personal data, and they align directly with the Digital Personal Data Protection Act of 2023. The DPDP Act ensures that personal data is processed lawfully, and using personal data without consent, which is of course crucial in deepfake creation involving non-consensual images or audio, that attracts severe penalties under this act. This integrated regulatory pressure is what forces platforms to innovate responsibly and to uphold integrity. This mandate dictates that the safety of citizens has to take priority over unconstrained, potentially harmful innovation. By requiring metadata and provenance, we're ensuring that when harm does occur, the content can be traced and the responsible party, be it the malicious user or the negligent platform, can actually be held accountable.
Intellectual charity is essential here, and we absolutely agree on the fundamental need for integrity and accountability, especially given those frightening crime statistics. However, we have to seriously acknowledge that overregulation, or regulation based on unproven technical feasibility, could fundamentally constrain legitimate AI innovation. We discuss metadata tracking. While it's necessary for provenance, that kind of tracking raises genuine fundamental privacy concerns about the mass surveillance of content creation. The constant risk of regulatory action based on high false positive rates could lead platforms to adopt an overly cautious, risk-averse posture, just restricting access to generative AI tools altogether, or severely limiting development of new, transformative models that are currently perfectly legal. So, instead of relying solely on technical mandates that carry these high risks, maybe the emphasis should be less on blanket mandates on creation tools and more on strengthening our existing governance architecture. We should be promoting robust AI literacy programs to empower citizens to recognize manipulation and strengthening enforcement against clear unlawful content through mechanisms we already have. For example, enhancing the capabilities of bodies like the Indian Cybercrime Coordination Center, I4C, and CERT-In. That allows us to target malicious content after the fact without stifling the tools of creation themselves.
Strengthening I4C and CERT-In is necessary, of course, but it is a reactive measure. These IT rules are an attempt to impose proactive, preventative due diligence. The implementation of clear, tangible labeling requirements, that 10% rule, the mandatory metadata, it provides actionable mechanisms for accountability now. It forces platforms to move towards solutions instead of waiting for detection systems to magically perfect themselves. This shift forces them to invest in provenance technology, which is the only real long-term defense against sophisticated SGI. You frame this as a debate about feasibility, but I see it as a debate about necessity. Just as financial markets had to comply with complex Know Your Customer rules, platforms must adapt to government's requirements that protect the public from systematic harm. And yes, compliance might be expensive and technically challenging at first, but the alternative, an ungoverned, unlabeled flood of deepfakes, is socially unacceptable.
And while necessity is a powerful driver, complexity often requires multiple perspectives to fully appreciate. The primary issue for me remains the enforcement liability. Mandating automated verification tools that current detection systems, which lack standardized benchmarks, simply cannot reliably fulfill. Well, it generates severe compliance costs and legal risks for these intermediaries, and that will ultimately stifle the very innovation we need to build better detection systems in the first place. The rules must therefore be seen as a starting point that requires continuous, swift review. Governance has to remain robust and highly adaptive. If the technology designed to defeat these digital markers evolves faster than the regulatory capability to enforce them, then we have to be willing to shift our focus away from blanket technical mandates and toward a more nuanced, risk-based approach that protects legitimate AI use.
Indeed, this is a complex regulatory field balancing rapid technological evolution, online safety, and the preservation of liberty. It requires constant scrutiny. We are, in effect, attempting to draw lines in constantly shifting digital sand.
And there is certainly much more to explore in the material regarding the long-term viability and adaptive nature of these measures, especially as generative AI continues to advance well past our existing detection capabilities.